And I really appreciate everyone's kindness as we've gone through this, but we're all on the mend, so we need to get you guys caught up and taken care of. So, all right. So I'm going to share my screen. So I want to begin with this idea of how has societies, and even when we look at here in the Americas versus the Eastern cultures and even the Western cultures, what is one general theme that can be seen that um, um, societies have viewed people with mental illness as? And if we look across cultures, the one theory that kind of is cohesive across cultures is what is known as moral corruption theory. Okay. Moral corruption theory is, in a general idea, is that a person has a mental illness because they do not have the moral fortitude that allows some type of demon or some type of evilness or some type of wickedness to then come into them and possess them, that then makes them act in a morally deviant way. Okay. And so, and we can see this in theories of the Americas. We can go back to the Aztecs, and in Southern America, we can look at Middle Eastern and Eastern ideas, and we definitely look at it in the Western perspective with Christianity and Muslim and with Jewish faiths. We can see this moral corruption theory play out. Okay. Now the question is though, if mental illness is due to some moral misgiving of an individual, they're suffering because they didn't have the moral strength to overcome their deficit. What were some ways that societies have dealt with this type of mental illnesses? And one of the earliest treatments, and I'm just going to go through these really quick. Some of the earliest treatments of mental illness, and again, Americas, Europeans, Eastern cultures have relied on these, is one of them is trephining. And we'll see examples of trephining here in a while. But trephining we have seen here on the American colonies with the Aztec and in the European colonies, where basically if someone is having some psychotic break, you drill a little hole in the top of the head, which is meant to release the demons or the thing that is possessing that person. Okay, and we'll get into trephining here in a moment. The other way is through social isolation or banishment. Basically, this is a threat that if you don't get rid of your moral demons, if you don't get rid of your demons, you're going to be ostracized. You're going to be rejected out of the community. Okay. And this is where you get the early forms of if you leave the village into the dark forest, there's going to be demons and evil things that are going to possess you there. So it's one, a method of keeping people in the village, because you don't want to go into the dark forest where we banish all the evil spirits. But you don't want to be banished there either. So the idea of the dark evil forest, the Robin Hood red forest, I think it is, idea came out of this fantasy of that came out of this social banishment issue, because you banish someone out of the village, they will starve and die, but that evil spirit will remain there in the forest. So you don't want to go there. It's a method of keeping people in, but it's a definitely a deterrent from having any type of mental breakdown in front of everyone else. Okay. And so, and we will see even in modern days, we have forms of banishment. If you think of the modern American prison system, it's banishment and social isolation in the guise of protecting the community. But it is basically a form of banishment and isolation to try and get them to say, hey, you need to be a better person. So we still see this in the modern systems that we have today. Okay. In Western culture, and this is where I'll divide two areas. In Western culture, we definitely have the ideas of the witch hunts, where people, because of social conditions and because of whatnot, came up to this idea that the reason why we have famine, the reason we have, is because there's these people who have these issues and they must be in contract with the devil to create evil. And so we need to isolate them and imprison them. And we can even see this in a lot of indigenous communities, not only here in the Americas, but when we look at indigenous communities throughout Africa, Australia, this idea of the influence of a bad spirit. Here in the Tanahatham, you have the Halakak. I'm not saying that correctly, Halahak, but that's a form of a witch in the Tanahatham tradition, that was a spirit that came and possessed the community. And so you get these notions of bad spirits and bad evil, these bad eggs, as you would say. Now, the thing that I would note, the difference between the witch hunts of Western culture and more of the indigenous cultures, is that indigenous cultures were less likely to banish those individuals. They felt that those people who were of bad spirit is because they weren't connected with the community, they weren't connected with nature, so their approach was to connect them. With the witch hunts, it was to free their spirit. So that, of course, was through burning them and killing them and releasing their spirits so that their spirit could be then go to the kingdom of God, as you would say. So there is difference in the way that different societies have treated the idea of witchery and demonology and all of those kinds of things. But there is a notion of it within each culture, even those cultures who have not been traditionally connected. Okay. So I do want to go through some of the early theories. As I mentioned, trephining, we can see not only in Western cultures, but we have examples of it here in American culture, where the idea is that you release an evil spirit through drilling a hole in the top of the head, and that releases the evil spirit. And so on this left pane, we see a Aztecian trephining. In the right pane, we see a European trephining idea. And the idea is that it would release the evilness from the individual. We see trephining throughout the 20th century. And I'm just going to play this short video of an early version of trephining in a medical setting, just to emphasize the point of what this looks like. So here we have, even in the early 19th and 20th century, they're drilling a hole in the top of the individual's head and again, at this time, it was still to kind of relieve the evilness or the corruption of the individual. Okay. I'm going to stop this video here because it is pretty intense, but I just want to point out that this is something that was well done into our Civil War, World War I, World War II eras of here in the United States. Now, the issue is that it actually has some beneficial treatments. Okay, what trephining actually led to was the release of TBIs. If no one knows what TBI is, it's traumatic brain injury. Something that they weren't privy to is early trephining was to release the evil spirit out of the individual's head. But what we found is that by drilling a hole in the top of for example, a military person's head that experienced some type of traumatic brain injury, that allowed the brain to swell out, which then made it so that the brain didn't squish itself inside the skull. Most people die from a TBI because the brain swells and it basically squishes itself inside the skull. But what we learned is that in early years, if you drill that hole, the brain would swell out of there and the brain wouldn't squish itself, and it increased the survival rate of military guys and gals who experience TBIs. Now, in extreme cases, it is still used today, but in most cases, they actually have learned that instead of drilling a hole in the top of someone's head, you put their head in a huge ice pack, basically. And that is the replacement for trephining in the military combat setting today. But going back to early days of trephining, just as an example, it was an effective treatment. If you think of it from kind of a naive perspective of the mind. Because one, if you drilled a hole in the top of their head, there's going to be two things that's going to happen. One, especially in the early days, it's going to get infected. That's going to then make the person be very lethargic because they're dying from an illness created or an infection in the top of their head. So here you have this person who is relieved of their psychotic or mental illness, and then they die, which also is a success because that means that they went to God and that evil spirit was left to them and they were saved. Okay. So either way, in the early days, this was seen as a very successful treatment for mental illness. Okay. Is there any questions on that thing? You could put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself.
No, sir.
Nothing for me.
Okay. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Kara. Okay. All right. All right. The next theory is because it really deals with a lot of Western medicine, and I think it's a very interesting theory to kind of reflect on, is the humor theory that started with the Greeks. Okay. And this has two reflections on it. One, the way it was treated, and the other, that it's still a kind of modern concept. So, one of the theories that came out of the ancient Greeks is that you could tell the health of the individual by their body fluids. Okay. So if you kind of see this kind of triangle square thing right here, if you were if you had too much phlegm, it meant you were unemotional. If your blood was sanguine or dark, it means optimistic or positive. Or if you had black poop, it meant sadness. If you had yellow bile, it meant that you were choleric or bad tempered or something like that. Okay. Literally, that's where the term humor comes from. When you say someone is humorous, you're saying that their body fluids are funny at that moment. That's where the term humor comes from. Okay. So when you say someone is of bad humor, It means that you're telling them that they have bad yellow bile. If you're saying that person doesn't seem to have much humor, you're saying that they have a black bile because they're being melancholy. Okay. If you say that they're sanguine, their blood is very vibrant, they're being optimistic and funny. Okay. So the term humor, it literally means body fluid when you translate it to Greek. Okay. Now, everyone laughs at this theory and they go, oh my, really seriously? Well, if you laugh at it, then you need to laugh at modern medicine. Okay. Because when you go to your doctor and you give them some symptoms, they're either going to tell you to pee in a cup or they're going to take some of your blood. And then they're going to take that urine and that blood and they're going to put it in this thing that spins it really fast. And it gives them some type of composition of what that blood and everything is. And they're going to say, well, based on the chemicals in your blood looks like you have diabetes. If you have that A1C level, right? Or you have too much calcium, or you have too much sugar, or it looks like in your urine, it looks like you have too many keystones, so you probably have a urinary tract infection. So if you think this theory is funny, remember we still use it today because doctors still look at your blood and look what it looks like and sees what it is. They still look at your urine and your bile to try and determine your health and where you are in your health. So while this theory sounds funny to us today, it is actually our main way of practicing medicine still today. With that being said, let's go back to um, uh, 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 some of the treatments that came out of this humorous theory. Because one of the main ways of treating an illness, if someone is sick, especially with a mental illness, is to release some of those fluids. And it's something called bloodletting. So, in the early days of mental illness treatment in the Greek tradition and then into the European tradition, they would set you on a table and they would put a needle up into your spinal cord and they would release blood. And it's called bloodletting or what's called cathartic release. And basically, they would release all what they called your bad blood until you were healed. Now, again, just like trephining, if you look at it from an ancient perspective, this was a very effective treatment. Because if you let enough blood out of a person, they're going to be at the point of death, where they're going to be so lethargic, they're not having psychotic symptoms, they're not having depressive symptoms, they're not having manic symptoms, they're not having any type of symptoms because they're on the brink of death, and therefore the person is cured. Okay, I'm going to stop there because Anasia has your hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, is that the same as what like modern day cupping is?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much like you're taking all the bad toxins out of your body like that.
Yep, that's the basic idea. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, if I put it in psychological terms, this came to what's called cathartic release. That early on in treatment of individuals, it was assumed that you just let them emotionally release all of their psychic energy, and that in itself is healing. So this notion you just go in and you just let everything go and all this and that, this is what is known as modern cathartic release. And it's been used in things like anger management, and it's called what's called the bottle up theory of anger management, that the reason why people have anger issues is they let things bottle up, bottle up, bottle up until the pressure is so much that then they just go on this anger rampage. Okay. And so the question is that fact or fiction? Is cathartic release a good idea for anger management or mental illness or whatnot? And the question is it's both fact and fiction. Okay. For anger management, for release of anger, telling someone to just go yell in the woods and whatnot and just let everything else, it's actually a bad idea. Because what it's shown is to actually increase aggression and anger after what was called the cathartic release. Do they feel psychologically relieved for a few minutes? Yes, they do. But what happens to a person who is angry and has a cathartic release is that they remember everything they're angry about. And so in that cathartic release, it makes them more angry. And so this idea of telling your kid or someone, just go yell in the yard and scream it out and you'll feel better, they'll feel better for a few minutes, but I would go hide, because if their aggression is towards you, you just increased your risk of aggression occurring to you or to whoever they were angry with or whoever they were going to go after. So as an anger management technique, according to the research, this is a very bad idea. Okay. But what about other mental illnesses like depression and anxiety and even some types of psychosis? Is this idea of cathartic release a good idea? Some research, some avenues of research suggest yes, it is. And I'll give you one. So the majority of people, about 80% of individuals who go to therapy, go to the first to second session, and then after that, they stop going. And researchers have wanted to know, why is it so few people go beyond the first or second session of treatment? And so we've asked these people who stopped going, hey, why did you stop going? We'll pay you a few bucks if you let us know. Just be honest with us. And the fact is that the hypothesis is they didn't like the therapist. They thought it was stupid. They didn't get anything out of it. They didn't want to do the work, some said. But what we found is that only actually represented about 10% of people who stopped going. Only about 10% said, oh, this is ridiculous, or this is stupid, or I just didn't connect with the therapist. For about 90% of them, they said, well, after going at the first or second session, I felt a relief of my symptoms. I felt a release of all of these things that were tying me down. And we were interested in that. And we're like, why is that? And it's due to the uniqueness of the therapy session. Because when you go into therapy, if it's a good therapist and it's an ethical organization, the first things that you will hear out of the therapist's mouth is, no one is going to know what you say beyond these four walls. But then they'll give the legal, unless you tell me you're abusing a child or abusing someone else or you're planning to kill someone. Okay, so they'll give that legal disclaimer, but they'll say, you can tell me anything you want, anything. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to tell your family. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to listen because I want to hear you. And for about 90% of people who go into treatment, that is the very first time someone has ever listened to them in a non-judgmental way in which they knew that they weren't going to go tell anyone else like a family member would or a friend would, or would sit there and tell you what you have to do, or you are being ridiculous, or you just need to get over this. It's the first time in those individuals' life where someone just sat there and listened, and allowing that emotional cathartic release after that first or second session relieved their symptoms, and they felt okay. They felt like they could function, they could go on, and they could exist in their world without any further intervention. Yes, Christy, that's exactly what it is. So in the end note, I encourage everyone to look at Christy's what she put in the chat about releasing it off your chest, all of those kinds of things. So cathartic release that came from bloodletting. It's a long stretch, I know. Does it work for high emotional aggression, steroid built, if we want to say that, emotions? No, it makes it worse. Does it work for emotionally based things like depression, anxiety, interpersonal problems? Absolutely. It shows that it works wonderfully when a person can just sit there and release all their emotions. I just wouldn't do it with someone who's angry. Just putting that out there. Okay, so that's the Greek humor theory. This is where we get to the ideas of what we should do with anger management. So, for example, today in anger management, we talked about coping skills to deal with anger instead of going and yelling out in the sky and yelling somewhere, because we found that that just makes people more angry. Um, and so it does have some precedence in how we should treat individuals. Okay, so that's another example of some more human-based type of perspectives on mental illness. So we can talk a little bit more about Western examples of moral corruption. We talked about the witch hunt. We spent a little bit of time talking about the witch hunts, and this is where society's insecurities with mental illness really come out. And I just want to make this a general statement. The witch hunts are a very interesting time. It brings up some very interesting professional development ideas within the field of expertise and all of those, which we won't get into in this class. But I would encourage you, if you want to become for example, a forensic psychologist, an expert witness of some type or whatnot, and go into that field, I would strongly encourage you to study the witch hunt eras, because this is where we get the era of the expert witness, or the expert who should know something that the client doesn't know or society doesn't know about this individual, but there's an expert out there that understands that. And I'll bring out one point about the witch hunts that is an example of this. This is the witch pricker. Okay, this was a developmental period in the idea that what we should do in understanding if there's a witch or not is find the marking of the devil. And so there were these men, and yes, they were all men. And the women, the people they investigated were all women, and they tended to be young women. They would go and they would make it so they would prick out all of their hairs on the female's body. And then they would closely investigate every aspect of the female's body until they found something which they called the mark of the devil, whether it was a birthmark or a mole or something like that. And then they would go in front of the court and say, I'm an expert and I know how to identify these things. And I identified this on this individual, and she is a witch. If she claims anything happened during the witch pricking, that's the devil in her talking. As you can imagine, that often happened in courts. But the reason why I bring this up is the witch pricker is our first idea of the expert witness in the court systems, in the Western court systems. And now we have modern psychiatrists and all of that. And you can probably guess each expert tends to be persuaded by whoever is paying them, right? So if I'm a defense attorney, for some reason, this individual has the same expertise as the prosecutors, attorneys. They both have psychiatry degrees from Stanford University, and they're examining the same individual, but they come to two different conclusions. This I bring to you guys' attention because the idea of the expert witness is not a perfect system. It's not something that we really should be trusting. And it also brings out that in the ideas of mental illness and deviant behavior, we're not experts in it as human beings. We haven't figured it out because two different people can bring from two different conclusions, and they really all come from this growing idea of moral corruption. I'm the moral one, even though I'm doing the unmoral thing by accepting this payment for my opinion that I call expert. I'll leave it at that. That's why I wanted to bring this up. But if you're going to go into, for example, forensic psychology or psychiatry to start to help people and stuff like this, just be careful of the corruption that can occur. Whether you work for the prosecutor or the defense, you should be objective, not subjective and personal gain. With that being said, that's my soapbox on the witch hunts. Again, if you're going to go into forensic psychology or you want to become an expert witness for something, I would encourage you to totally investigate the witch hunts and how they were investigated and everything like that, because they are the modern model for the expert witness. With that being said, if we look at some Native American approaches, again, we can look at things such as the medicine man and the medicine woman, and dysfunction, and a lot of dysfunction arising from disharmony between the person and nature. And we still see this in a lot of modern Native American communities where a person will go to a medicine person and they'll prescribe things like social isolation, connection with the community, connection with this, and focus on the journey more than your depravity that led you there. And so even the thing that I do want to appreciate about Native Americans' approaches to this is that it is a dysfunction that doesn't arise from necessarily moral dysfunction, as earlier theories suggested, but from the person deviating from their personage and their nature and their community, which is really a good approach when we consider how we should be approaching communities today. That really, it's the disharmony between the person and nature that does really create a lot of the dysfunction we see today. All right. So I do want to end today with two concepts, and they're kind of important concepts. I do want to talk about how what I view good psychologists and counselors view when they're assessing someone who comes to them with some psychological problem or some deviation that they're experiencing. And I think this model has a lot of promise. It's something that if you go on in social work or psychology or counseling, that you will become very well versed in. And that is the biopsychosocial model. Okay. We're becoming, I hope we're becoming, even though I've already noted some bias in the expert witness area and whatnot, that psychological issues, social issues are not due to one thing. They're due to a combination of human experiences. So they're due to our biological predispositions. We talked about historical trauma, which is being shown to be on the epigenetic traits of a lot of individuals. We can talk about the heritability of things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and those other type of biologically based disorders. But that's not where it stops. We also know that there's psychological movers of disorders. So the way we think about our world. So the best example I have for the psychological area is people who suffer from severe depression. They get into what's called cyclical thinking, where they start off with, I'm a bad person. And then they spend their day going through what's called self-confirmation, where they find every little thing that proves that they're a bad person. And then they purposely, unconsciously, usually self-destruct themselves during that day, that then proves to them behaviorally that they're a bad person. And it's a psychological kind of process that they get into. And part of treatment in this area is to try and stop those thought processes, to stop those bad thinking ideas, to get a person beyond what's called confirmation bias, where we confirm everything we see and we ignore completely everything that is contrary to our confirmed idea. Okay, so if we look at best treatment, for example, for depression, yes, there are good biological treatments, SSRIs, serotonin that makes sure that you have enough serotonin in your brain. There's different, we've already talked about different electrical treatments that interrupt the neural processes of those, but that's only for people with severe depression. But then on the psychological end, we can work with individuals on that end about stopping those thought processes. But then we're understanding that there's also a huge social component, that relationships matter. Human beings by nature are a social species. We cannot exist without each other. We need each other for survival. Okay. And so on the social level, we look at things like relationships and whether that person has healthy, strong relationships, how a person views relationships. Okay. If we went through the developmental section, we would have talked about something called emotional labeling. This is where in early childhood, infants cognitively label the emotions that they're feeling. And we have found that within social relationships, because emotions are a social event, they're not a psychological event. Emotions tell us there's something right or wrong, but they're also meant as an expression to others that we're feeling something's right or wrong. And in the context, I might have mentioned this in this class, in the context of social relationships, people who tend to get in really bad relationships later in adulthood tend to have those labels mislabeled in early childhood. Okay, so I think the example I used earlier in the semester is a child who we have the archetype of mother. Mother represents love. But if mother is abusive, is demeaning, is neglectful, that becomes our label for love. So when we get into adulthood, what we're comfortable with is relationships that are abusive, demeaning, and hurtful, because we think that that's what represents that emotion. Okay, so we look at these things from this biopsychosocial model now. And I would encourage you, if you have a child in treatment, if you're going into treatment, if you're putting a loved one into treatment, ask them the model they use. If they don't use these terms, I would encourage you to use someone else. That's just your professor's opinion, but it's something that I would strongly encourage you to consider. All right, so we went from, I'm going to stop right here because we're almost